We're going to get started, and we're going to kick things off with our usual quick preface, just for those of you who haven't tuned in before, and those of you online later who are going to watch this later. This is now our 5th webinar, and ClimateX is an experiment, an 8-week experiment that is coming out of MIT. The MIT Office of Digital Learning, which is responsible for delivering open courseware and MITx courses to global learners around the world, is teaming up with a group of concerned MIT students and alumni, which is partly centered around a group called MITiCal. And we're teaming up with the ClimateX team, which is headed by Rajesh, who's joining us here, to form a partnership and try this experiment in finding ways to create more meaningful engagement between the MIT community and people all around the world who care about climate change and climate action.
Thanks, Mark. We are really happy to welcome Mara Freilich, who's a graduate student at MIT in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences, EAPS, right. The very tall building at the center of the campus. But right now she is in Chile. I don't know exactly where in Chile, but Mara will tell us. And so we have an international panel in every sense of that term today. Mara will be talking about her work in Rhode Island, which is something that we at ClimateX are very, very excited about, because it's a combination of scientific work and citizen activism. So I think that is exactly the kind of engagement that we are looking for through the ClimateX platform. So Mara, welcome, and can you say a few words about where you're coming from and where you want to go?
Thanks. Yes, I'm Mara Freilich. I'm a PhD student in the MIT Hui Joint Program in Oceanography. So there I study the influence of ocean physics on phytoplankton communities, cycling of nutrients, cycling of carbon in the oceans. And as Rajesh mentioned, right now I'm a Fulbright scholar living in Santiago, Chile. And here I'm studying stochastic models of interactions between species. But kind of transitioning a little bit, today I'll be kind of sharing the story of a campaign I worked on in Rhode Island in 2014, and I'm hoping to spark a conversation among everybody about action at the local level. And so given that I just introduced myself with a background, it's clear that I'm not an expert in policy, and I'm not a professional activist by any means. And so yeah, I hope to involve the whole ClimateX community in this conversation. That as a scientist, I worked on this because I believe that, well, there is still work to be done in science on the response to climate change, particularly in understanding the regional, local effects that we might experience in the medium term to long term because of climate change. And certainly technological challenges in terms of how we can transition away from a fossil fuel economy. I really think that we lack a political and social structure, and that these political social structure needs to be in conversation with science. And also that it's important for scientists to be able to understand and communicate across disciplines to make effective change.
Okay. Before we move on to the study that you participated in, just in the interest of bringing science more into an easier communication with the public, you mentioned that you're a Fulbright scholar who is pursuing stochastic models. Now, I think I know what stochasticity is, but I am not 100% sure if everybody listening to this video will. So, if it would be great if you can explain in really elementary terms what that is and why you think that's an important way to address climate science.
Sure. So this is actually an ecology project, but I'm working on the way that species interact with each other. And some models for those interactions that might be predator-prey, one thing eats another, they're competing with each other for food or shelter or something like that. And stochasticity means randomness. And the reason I'm using stochasticity in my model is that we can't observe all variables, especially when we're talking about ecology or climate. And even if we can observe all variables, we can't observe all variables at all times. And so I'm using stochasticity to account for random birth deaths. We don't actually know when a birth might happen or a death might happen, and for interactions that we don't know are happening, or we don't know exactly how and when they happen.
Just to put in a plug for randomness and stochasticity, most of the universe is stochastic, as we know, from the quantum level to the galactic level. And the more you understand how uncertainty works, the more likely it is that you will not be a sucker, because because in fact there's one definition of probability, right? Which is it's called the Dutch book argument, which is the probability of something is the likelihood that I will pay you that percentage of a dollar to buy that thing from you. So if you're not pricing it right, then you are going to lose money. And so if you are interested, I think there are lots of courses on edX and other platforms where you can learn a little bit more about data and probability. But let's not get sidetracked from our main topic. So Mara, tell us a little bit about the background of how you joined this particular project in Rhode Island, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Yeah, so as we talk about this, I think just in general, I'm going to be talking about two really main themes. One is listening, and the other is movement building, in terms of what I think are really, really important for how professionals or how even citizens in any field could be engaging to make change at the local level. And so one of the things that motivated this project was I was part of the Rhode Island Student Climate Coalition. And we were approached by Art Handy, who is a state representative that we'd worked with in the past for a bill on emissions reductions targets called the Global Warming Solutions Act. So we'd been working on that bill since 2008, and he approached us in 2014 saying that he didn't think the bill had a chance of passing that year, but he thought it might have a chance if we could help him to rewrite the bill in a way that included adaptation to climate change. And so the Global Warming Solutions Act and this bill, which we then came to call the Resilient Rhode Island Act. So the Resilient Rhode Island Act is the act that I'm going to be talking about, which is the local bill we wrote in 2014, was motivated by a failure of federal action and the state-by-state strategy that's worked with other issues like gay marriage. But what was unique about our approach was that by including adaptation, it wasn't just kind of implementing at the state level what we would really like to see at a national level, which is ambitious targets for reducing our carbon emissions. Instead, we were saying it's really, really important that we focus on what's going on at the local level, how climate change is affecting people here, and taking a comprehensive view of the problem and the solution to the problem. And it seemed to be a good time to be working on this. So divestment from fossil fuels and the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline were really ramping up nationally, including in Rhode Island, where we had a strong movement for divestment on my campus, Brown University, another strong movement, at least at University of Rhode Island as well. So it seemed to just be a really good moment for ambitious action on climate change. The conversation was already there, so we didn't have to start that. And we had people who were dedicated to solving the problem. And so what we ended up doing as students is we partner with a sociology research lab, and we wrote what would be kind of a dream bill for adaptation to climate change, or it included some aspirational elements, some practical elements. And I can talk more about what the aspirations were that didn't pass if there's interest. And then what eventually passed was an emissions reductions targets that were benchmarked to years, and a process to evaluate progress to the targets, and to propose actions to meet the targets, and then a similar process for adaptation to climate change. Yeah, and so the bill, we introduced the bill in 2014, we started writing it in December of 2013, and it passed in June of 2014. And kind of since then, the bill has been used by the Conservation Law Foundation in filings against specific fossil fuel projects. And we're still waiting because the implementation plans are due soon at the end of the year.
Okay, this is fantastic. So can you flesh out the details a little bit about how you went? I mean, after all, it's been used in court, or presumably by the Conservation Law Foundation. But how do we get stuff from A to Z? How do we go from collecting data or working with citizens, finding out their interests? It would be great if you can walk us through some of those steps.
Yeah. And so deciding what goes into the bill was the first step. And as the experts in a research team, the ones working on writing down what was going on paper, we had been given a lot of power. And part of that came from being associated with this academic institution. And kind of our constant conversation throughout was, how do we make sure that this isn't just an academic project? And how do we make sure that the ownership is really within the community and not within our research lab or even our student climate coalition? Yeah, so one of the things that we did was we wanted to make sure that the process was held true to our values. That besides stopping climate change, it was really important that we wrote something that was going to be centered on social inclusion and justice, and so that we weren't prioritizing stopping climate change over every other social issue. And we thought the way to do that was to not frame it or approach it as just an environmental issue, that we were going to be using this moment in just a wide range of social issues. Yeah, so we really had three main sources of information. The first was listening sessions. The second was reports that had already been prepared. And then the third was examples from other cities and towns and more academic papers. Yeah, and so I can talk a little bit more about each of those. So for the listening sessions, we convened stakeholders to tell us what they would like to see and what they were concerned about related to climate change and to potential regulation of carbon emissions, potential regulation, or government involvement in adaptation to climate change. So these included environmental justice groups, other types of environmental groups, and community organizations like land trusts, some cultural organizations, some church groups. And so we would go as researchers and talk to the community, say, here's our project, here's what we are thinking of so far, what do you think of this? Do you have any other suggestions for things that you'd like to include? And then, so for the reports that had already been prepared, there were two really excellent ones. And I'm going to mention them because I think that this is the kind of feedback for what academics could be producing that would be really useful for taking concrete action. So one had been prepared by the Rhode Island Department of Health. And it was useful because it had really specific statistics about which parts of the state and of the city of Providence were most affected by climate change and how. So included things like inequality in asthma rates, different health challenges, vector-borne diseases, all this whole array of issues that might be affecting the state, and just provided a really great basis for saying we actually do know, synthesizing however much we did know about what was going on about the problem at the time. And the other had been prepared by the Environmental Council of Rhode Island in collaboration with the Environmental Justice League, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, which is a racial justice organization, English for Action, which is the immigrants' rights organization and educational organization, Friends of Buckland Park, and the African Alliance of Rhode Island, and then the Rhode Island Student Climate Coalition, which I was a member of at the time. And that report had been motivated by intense flooding in Rhode Island. So this intense flooding could be seen as kind of our flashpoint disaster moment, like Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina on the national level. So in 2010, there were 200-year floods in 1 year, which are floods that have every year just a 1% chance of happening, but we had 2 of them in 1 year. And in the city of Providence, the effects were made worse by lack of infrastructure in some under-resourced areas and toxic sites, which then the flooding caused leaching into neighboring development. And so the report used that as kind of a jumping off point and went into those communities that were most affected by flooding and asked, what resources could help you adapt to the effects of climate change? sometimes without even saying it, adaptation or climate change as words, just saying, here are all of these weather infrastructure challenges that face our communities, and how what could the government doing, what could your communities be doing to better prepare for these?
Great. So now you have campaign on your hands. You have a draft bill. So what comes next? Like, how did you build a campaign to pass the bill once it was written?
Yeah, I guess one other important thing to mention, just to give credit where credit is due, the students didn't actually write the legal language. We had funding. We hired a consultant who'd worked in the state Senate and worked in the Office of Energy Resources before, and he's the one who translated this into legal language. Another really helpful partnership. Yeah, so building the campaign really started well before we even knew we were going to be working on this bill, and before we decided to work on this bill, and kind of as soon as we started. So even before we worked on the bill, we'd been, as Rhode Island Student Climate Coalition, we'd been working on our relationships and other campaigns against climate change, and working on building a stronger climate movement in Rhode Island. But as far as jumping off the campaign, the listening sessions were really the first step. So in going to other groups and saying, here's what we're working on, here's what we're thinking about. Something else we could ask is, how do you want to be involved? And so making sure that other groups had ownership from the very beginning of the project was something that helped to make the process of passing the bill stronger overall, to make sure that people were heard from the beginning, rather than having to engage in the public process with us as kind of in a more adversarial type of way. And so the people who we included in the listening sessions and invited to be part of that project were the first groups we hoped would mobilize support. And they ended up being speakers at our rallies and giving testimony at the State House as well.
So could you tell us like an anecdote or a story about how a specific listening session helped you influence the passing of the bill? Like maybe, you know, a key event that happened, or someone who came into your coalition?
Yeah, so I think it was, one thing that was good was we were able to include some kind of non-traditional allies for the climate movement as well, because we weren't framing this as just an environmental issue. And so the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless had recent legislative success. They'd passed a homeless bill of rights, which everybody was really excited about, and was kind of the type of thing that we wanted to do by saying citizens have rights to do certain things as adaptation to climate change in the face of extreme weather. And they joined the campaign as being a very vulnerable population to climate change. And the initial bill did have an amendment that they endorsed to the Homeless Bill of Rights, which said they have right to protection from extreme weather just as any other group does, which was important given the lack of disaster shelters in the state. They lack shelters in general, but also the problem becomes particularly acute during a natural disaster time. Yeah, so that was an anecdote of a particular group that we were able to get involved through these listening sessions.
How many listening sessions did you guys organize?
I'm actually not sure. I was involved in all of them, but I was involved in at least 4 of them. And so we tried to target them to groups that were already formed and go to the group and hold it in a space that was easy for them to convene members.
So how did you boil down all that? I mean, let's say you were 4 and maybe there were another 10. I don't know, let's say there were at least 10 listening sessions. Do you think that, I mean, that's a lot of time and input. So how did you condense all that into a document or a report that then went forward? Yeah,
so our original bill was very long. It was 26 pages long, and the bill that eventually passed was only 6 pages.
Okay.
And so this diverse coalition, I think, reflecting back, one of the things that we didn't do particularly well was kind of building the movement in a way that would make sure that all of these diverse perspectives were actually included in the end. And so I got a question from Robert. This was actually really, really fast. We started the preparatory work for actually writing the bill in December of 2013. And the deadline for introducing the bills was around February of 2014. So we did this really quickly. And it helps that some of these reports had already been prepared. These groups were already in conversation about what they wanted to see. At least the mitigation side of the bill was already written in the Global Warming Solutions Act. Yeah, so I think one of the benefits of our coalition was that we were able to have really diverse tactics that were also awareness raising. So things like rallies and phone calls from church groups and students who were able to kind of be more creative and aggressive in their tactics, petitioning from small businesses and all of these other things. But I think the downside was that I'm not sure we effectively met our goals of making this an environmental justice bill that genuinely included all of these diverse perspectives. I think that was something that wasn't excluded by the bill that eventually passed, but all of these kind of aspirational elements, these policies that were proposed by the groups, almost none of them were actually included in the final draft of the bill. They were deferred into committees, which are still preparing their reports about how this will actually be implemented. Which is just to say that creating a movement is particularly important. And I think that's something we didn't get to develop as fully as we would have liked to, just because the bill passed so quickly within 6 months, not leaving sufficient time to build a strong movement with cohesive demands and fully developed demands about particular elements that were really, really important to all groups, and to build a consensus among the groups they were working with. And so implementation of the bill, especially this type of format where most of the details have been deferred to committees later, really depends on continued pressure.
So what might you have done differently? I mean, like in hindsight,
yeah.
Is there something you would do differently?
I think we may not have introduced a bill the first year, for example. And this is something that I think may be a challenge with these types of campaigns coming out of an academic community, or confined to a small community in general, is that you might not have the time or the funding to say, well, we're going to defer and try to make this action happen over a longer term. That in our case, students were graduating who had a lot of expertise in these areas, and we didn't know how long funding would last for this project and things like that. But yeah, doing a better job of kind of convening first and then taking an action step later, rather than saying, well, our goal is to introduce a bill in February. Instead saying, well, our goal is to craft an effective environmental justice response to climate change, and then seeing if introducing a bill in February was the right thing to do to make that happen.
So we got a question from Robert. He's asking us to clarify what listening actually means.
Yeah, so we were actually having conversations with people. We either in our lab would invite people to come or go to particular community organizations. And have a we would print out what our draft bill, our draft bullet points, or things like that, and have a conversation about what was written down. And Rhode Island's a very small state. Kind of blurs the line between city and state, given that there's one big city, Providence, which means that we knew a lot of the people already who we were working with, and a lot of these relationships were already built through people who were neighbors with each other, or people we'd worked with on campaigns before, or things like that.
A couple more questions from me, and I think it will be great to open it up to the audience. I'm actually channeling questions from our other participants, actually. This is very much a political issue. I mean, after all, you ended up with a bill. So, and you started by saying that it was a way to circumvent the logjam at the federal level. So do you know other states that are succeeding at this, so who are doing something similar to Rhode Island, or states that have tried and failed?
Yeah, so there are actually a number of states in 2008 that did manage to pass something equivalent to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that wasn't completely without regard for what was going on at the federal level, but it was kind of the beginning of the state-by-state strategy. I know that there are right now state-by-state campaigns for carbon taxes, but I really think where we're seeing this local fight now, that this legislative strategy was maybe something from 2008, and I think where we're seeing the local fight now is in opposition to infrastructure projects. That there's always been opposition to infrastructure projects from the type of NIMBY view, which stands for not in my backyard, or the idea that nobody really wants to have these polluting industries right next to them, but maybe wants them to exist. And now there's a kind of developing consensus in the environmental movement to say nowhere, and that we're going to fight them whether they're in our own backyards or somewhere else, with a particular view towards recognizing the kind of marginalization that's been created by these projects, and meaning that they have generally been built in low-income communities and in communities of color, and that's had health effects and economic effects on those communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in the legislative work continues, proposing particular solutions. As far as I know, I think in the Pacific Northwest there are a few carbon tax proposals. There is a carbon tax proposals in Massachusetts and Rhode Island as well.
So one final question before we open it up to the audience.
Yeah.
It's more of a personal question. So you did all this, and then you're now doing stochastic models, right? So is that a big shift? Do you see this more public-oriented work as something that you have set aside for a little bit, or do you see it as, you know, being part of what you do still in a different way?
So that's something I'm thinking about personally. I just started my graduate program. And so I was never a full-time organizer. While working on this, I was a student studying applied math. So now I'm a student working on my PhD, and more closer to a professional track, which does make a difference for me. But I think part of the reason that I'm here talking about this as a non-expert is that I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations, and that I can talk about these things as a scientist, but I can also talk about these things as a concerned citizen. And I think I want to make sure that that space still exists for myself and for other scientists and other PhD students to see themselves as scientists and students, but also to see themselves as concerned citizens and being able to get involved in the communities they live in off campus, in addition to engaging with issues of equity and their livelihoods on campus as well. So a kind of general view of empowerment and being able to create change, not as a professional activist.
I really like the idea of the concerned citizen scientist, where you can club the words in as many different ways as possible, right? So you could be a concerned citizen scientist, you could be a concerned citizen who's a scientist, and a concerned citizen scientist. So it's interesting to see how all of those are coming together in your own work. Do you have something to say to your peers and your colleagues who might be wondering about the same thing? Like, how do I manage my work life with these more moral concerns, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's been really important to me is to develop strong communities, both outside and inside of science. So one of the things within science is to have a group of people who I know are going to be supportive of this work and understanding of this work, which isn't just finding people, it's also talking with people and raising awareness of kind of my worldview, of their own worldview, and having these conversations about why science operates the way it does and how we want science to operate in a way that provides more fulfilling lives and also works for just in a more general sense. And then having community outside of science I think is really, really critical, in that it holds you accountable for either doing the work in the first place, but doing the work in a way that's not just coming from academia, that's coming from a more general view, or in a way that's genuinely empowering others and genuinely working towards change that will benefit everyone in the community and work for justice.